I'm Natalie Kane.
I'm Tobias Revel. Haunted Machines began with a mini-conference supported by and presented at Future Everything 2015 in Manchester, a place where, as Warren Ellis pointed out, the devil's hoofs struck the desk of noted alchemist and scientist John Dee. This started an ongoing project interrogating the prevalence of magical narratives in the way we talk about technology.
What do we mean when we say something works like magic or is magic? Where do the mythologies around technology reduce our power to have influence over them? For this radio show, we take a look at alchemy and alchemical thinking and where we see it now. Alchemy is the imitation and emulation of nature's most secret operations, as Giuseppe Del Rey writes in his essay about the spirit of alchemy, the act of turning one thing into another seemingly improbable thing, the most classical example being the turning of lead into gold. Over the next hour, we'll be looking at transmutation and transformation, control and change, and where in technology, science and art we see it occur.
Scientific practice is often inhabited by those with a prescribed, perceptively secretive knowledge of those things which are hidden or unexplained. So what does it mean to reveal the nature of processes and show how the magic was done?
Where do we see contemporary alchemy and scientific practice, and is there an argument in keeping some things under lock and key?
We talk to those working with synthetic biology about the mastery of nature, the alchemical ideal, and where control is exercised to make sure the right people have access to this type of power.
Later, we'll look at the material of the digital, data, which to the unskilled changes through processes locked inside the black box, where you can see what goes in and comes out, but never what happens inside. We ask what the revealing of this information does, who has the power to translate it into forms we can see, and what it does for our understanding of ourselves and the wider world. Once we've revealed these alchemical processes and made the invisible visible, is it enough? What does the convergence between art and science do for demystifying hidden things?
In the Western world, alchemy was practiced between the 12th and roughly 18th century, and then became mixed up with the occult and morphed into being something completely different. The type of alchemy that I investigate is really a craft with a natural philosophical background. So a hands-on experimentation with scientific theories behind it.
To begin with, we need to look back at the history of alchemy and its role in the history of science and culture.
My name is Anke Timmermann. I am a historian of alchemy and an antiquarian bookseller at Quaritch in London. I've got a PhD from the University of Cambridge, where I studied history of science with a specialism in history of alchemy in the 15th through 17th century, and had a fairly international career as a historian of alchemy. So the theory was that the world was made up of the four Aristotelian elements: water, air, earth, and fire. And those make different matter in different permutations. And so once you understand how that works together and isolate them and put them together in a different combination, then you can transform one matter into another. The other theory that underlies alchemy is that metals grow in the earth and they all start out as lead, which is the most common metal, or that was the most common and least valuable metal known at the time, and also had the most mass. And so the lead in alchemical theory included a lot of impurities. As an alchemist, you try to remove those impurities. The theory was that that was happening in the earth anyway. So if lead was left to its own devices in the earth and shone upon by its guardian planet, then it would slowly ripen to become a slightly more refined metal, lose some of its imperfections, and go through the cycle of the seven metals until it turns into silver, and then a few millennia later into gold. The task of the alchemist, or the person practicing alchemy, is to accelerate that process.
Today, alchemy is invoked in the same breath as magic and the occult. However, as opposed to more mystical practices, it was a core part of science, or natural philosophy as it was known, for almost 600 years.
Alchemy practiced in the Western world between the 12th and the 18th century had absolutely nothing to do with magic. It was not supernatural. It was nothing artificial. There was art in it. It is the art of alchemy. But It was trying to understand creation, how matter behaves in nature, and then trying to accelerate that process and making everything more refined through methods that you would find goldsmiths using anyway, or many other people in craft professions, burning, dissolving in acids, combining in different ways, and yes, experimenting to find out how you can produce gold. I should interject, at this point it is actually possible to make lead into gold, to transform lead into gold. All you need is a particle accelerator. It has been done.
Although we may laugh off the idea that the activity of particle accelerators fulfills the dreams of alchemy, it provokes an examination of how we think about this dead science. The methods and frameworks through which they pursued their experiments may have been flawed as we understand them, but the goals of alchemists are much the same as our own. Often, when talking about magic, I draw a parallel between its basis in intent and our current technologies. For example, one of the purported aims of magic was to project yourself at a great distance. How is this any different to Skype? The alchemists may have had a flawed scientific understanding of the world, but they gave us much in terms of ambition and structures with which to examine it.
Without alchemy, there would not have been the development of chemistry, because that was all in reaction to alchemy not having a precise language, alchemy not organizing things in a manner that was thought to be desirable in the 18th century. So without the experimentation, the knowledge about materials and the methods having gone into it beforehand, no one would have suggested that there is a need to develop a chemistry that is precise and has an exact language to describe it. So that's one thing. We would not have modern pharmacy without alchemy. The idea of chemical remedies, that you can influence the workings of your body by swallowing something that has been produced with what we would now call chemical methods, really dates from that period. The knowledge about certain materials, alcohol is often presented as one of the prime examples. The distillation processes behind it, really anything that has methods intersecting with other areas, distillation, fermentation, things we know from other areas of life. And then the production of equipment, the control of heat, because there were no ovens that could control temperature. So refining methods very, very precisely. I would argue that the questions, methodologies, and the care that goes into producing material equipment all derive from a long tradition that very much started with alchemy.
This history of alchemy that has given so much to the contemporary scientific and technological landscapes seems at odds with the pop culture imagery of alchemy as a secretive, almost sinister activity. However, historically, alchemy was widespread and a common and open part of many professions.
Many professions were involved in alchemy. If you wanted to, you could engage with alchemy as a goldsmith, as a pharmacist, as a doctor, as a cleric, scholar. Anyone who had access to either the materials or the books got interested in it. It was just another way of approaching the understanding of the world.
This is further evidenced by its prominent role in not only European scientific history, but in European cultural history as well.
It was incredibly common. You only need to look at poetry from the 15th, 16th century. Metaphysical poetry used a lot of alchemical metaphors. Shakespeare talked in a very intelligent way about things to do with alchemy. Alchemists, and in this sense really the term alchemist as a derogatory term, alchemists were made fun of in Chaucer, in other products of popular literature.
Taking then the idea of alchemy as an open, central part of scientific and cultural history, perhaps the best place to start our contemporary examination of the practice is looking at the professionalization of the sciences, considering where the alchemist sits today in the scientific landscape.
Firstly, for me, on the question of magic in technology, I think it's rather an interesting move. So if we think about what magic means, for me, it's about mechanisms that are concealed and mysterious.
It was reassuring talking to Dr. Daniel Glaser in his office at King's College London on one of those last beautiful September mornings to find that his concerns about magic aligned with our own.
My name is Dr. Daniel Glaser. I'm Director of Science Gallery London, which is part of King's College London. Historically, I'm a neuroscientist, which I did for about 15 years, looking at visual cortex in the brain, so how the brain does seeing. And then in between that and now, I was at the Wellcome Trust, where I was responsible for all of their funding for public engagement and the arts. The definition of magic for me, a definition, is that you can't see how it works. But if you were to take the lid off and understand it, you'd know it would no longer be magical. You'd see behind the curtain, the trick would be revealed. It would no longer be magic, it would be a trick. And I do think that technology is moving in that direction. Perhaps a good example is cars. So it used to be the case that if your car broke down, a sensible thing to do was to lift the bonnet. That's pretty pointless these days because now cars are essentially magical. Only wizards can change how they work, and for the average user, there's nothing for you under the bonnet. In fact, there's nothing for the wizard under the bonnet without her magic wand. She needs the computer and the technology. You can't bash it with a spanner anymore. So I think technology is moving towards that, and I think what that means is that we're all being turned into dumb users.
Dr. Glaser refers to the power that software has as an invisible actor to securitize control over our technological systems. Talking about the use of software as secretive through its obfuscation is one thing, but for Martin House, more interested in where software is used rather than how, software possesses magical properties because of the invisibility of its actions.
My name is Martin House. I kind of would say that I'm some kind of artist working at an intersection between, let's say, art, technology, science. Or one possible definition of magic is that it's words, language, symbolic structures which are doing things in the world without the kind of, without there being a kind of transparent implementation, So obviously if I just write down some instructions for you and you execute those instructions, that's not really magic. But if I simply write them and the things happen which I'm writing down, if I write, it will rain and if I do this enough times, then... So software is kind of like that. It does things in the world which are kind of magical through this kind of material interaction which has been engineered out of Earth substrates.
For Martin, software is just a part of the reconfiguration of the material of the Earth.
And interested primarily in the last few years through kind of experiential work or through kind of hands-on situations in figuring out some kind of connection between what I would define as technology and the Earth, considered as Earth, as world, as material, as kind of substrate, as this kind of underlying materiality, this kind of matter which is not language, which is not meaning, but something else.
Martin works at an intersection between art and science in a way that is consciously alchemical. He constructs experiments and performances such as The Crystal World with Jonathan Kemp, in which consumer gadgets and computers are chemically dissolved into sludge and crystals. These experiments seek to blend the stuff of the world, earth, software and symbols, and find connection between them. For him, alchemy is all about transformation.
You always have these transformations, so it's like whether it's a material transformation of base matter into gold, but for me it is about this transformation of matter into language or symbolic structures and the elaboration of this and that's how I start to begin to see this in relation to technology, because for me technology is also nothing but that transformation. If you just look at the kind of the code side, you can start to kind of break down these layers of abstraction, and starting with, okay, you have, the silicon, you have the electrons, you have the holes, you have all of this, which is kind of quite hard to explain, but that's not really the problem. But that's not where it's happening, because that's got nothing to do with the code. Okay, so you find somewhere in between, which might be like a intermediary machine code or something like this, which is closer to the processor, but that's also not where it's happening. Like everywhere you look, it's not there. I mean, is it happening in people's, bank balances? Is that, is it happening? There's also that whole kind of social side of like execution and software. So this was more or less my kind of primary interest, was writing pieces of software that would be about trying to find that place, but also not really wanting to find it, but just provoking a kind of search for this. And then this related through kind of reading about alchemy and reading those kind of texts. You could start to find links between alchemy, Hermeticism, people like Ramon Lull with these combinatorial discs and so on were quite obvious. I mean, these are quite clearly relating to software.
Martin paints a picture of a truly wholesome reading and interpretation of the very stuff of the world. In an academic sense, we might call this interdisciplinary, but Martin truly thinks like an alchemist, with an holistic interpretation of the connection of all things coming from the earth. In the sense that we might understand it now, there was never such a thing as an alchemist as profession. Only men, largely, of various professions who pursued alchemical sciences along with the swathe of techniques, skills and understandings that made up the natural philosophies, as Dr. Timmerman explains.
It doesn't really make sense for that period to talk about alchemists. There was no such profession as being an alchemist. No one took the profession of being an alchemist. You couldn't make a living as an alchemist. It was really people in different professions who were working with metals, medicines, learning that intersected with natural philosophy, that took an interest in alchemy and then either experimented or investigated the theory of alchemy, or both.
Today we find ourselves in a world of hyper-specialization. As Dr. Timmerman said, the possibility of turning lead into gold requires a particle accelerator to make real, and that is no small home laboratory project.
If you talk about, for example, the Large Hadron Collider, the epitome of modern science, the users of it, the scientists, understand their own bit of kit, but they are essentially powerless without the magical collective apparatus, the social organization that makes it possible. You couldn't come in of a weekend and run an experiment on the Large Hadron Collider. So as science and scientific machines, the technology of science, become more complicated, we're transformed as scientists also into users, and to that extent they are a bit magical. There are still bits of science you can do with the tape measure, magnifying glass notebook, and in those contexts you can really get under the bonnet and see what's going on.
So when dealing with large-scale, multi-year mega-projects, is there a place for the renegade scientist? Are those romantic dreams of the rank outsider making critical breakthroughs from their bedroom resigned to the stuff of legend?
In scientific research, the professionalization of science, which has happened consistently over the last 150 or so years. I mean, you'll know that the word scientist was invented in 1836, so hundreds of years after the word science. But the professionalization of science, which the Victorians undertook, is now largely complete. So in almost all scientific domains, including things like maths, it's almost impossible now, maths there are some exceptions, for there to be a breakthrough from outside the disciplinary walls.
Ultimately, alchemy fell out of favour with the scientific and cultural worlds. By the 18th century, the new science of chemistry was being put forward to supersede it, and alchemy was being pushed into the occult.
Especially in England, once chemistry had been introduced and vastly promoted by the Royal Society, the effort was to separate chemistry, the new system, the one that was getting all the money and all the fame and that was published about in journals, from what was now decried as the old system of alchemy, which was supposed to be imperfect, imprecise, generally not a science. So it was really at that point that the separation took place very much from the agenda of the new science.
The successes of chemistry had the effect of pushing alchemy to the sidelines and inadvertently into the occult. The establishment of modern scientific methods and culture made alchemy untenable to the burgeoning scientific community.
Alchemy is a selfish, although as we've said, also futile pursuit, in the sense that if you succeed, the achievement will be worthless because anyone could make gold. Unless you succeed, but you succeed not to tell anyone how you've succeeded. So if you can retain control of the technology that you've developed, then your achievement is worth something. And I suppose that's why alchemy, in a fundamental sense, is an unscientific process. Because in the way that we understand science today, It's only done if it's replicated. If you haven't published it, it's as if you didn't do it. By definition, if you are to gain value from alchemy, you have to keep your methods hidden, and that would rule it out as a scientific pursuit by modern standards.
The immediate thought here is to draw comparison to horror stories of miserly pharmaceutical and agricultural corporations, jealously hoarding intellectual property to control how humans eat and survive, like the secret of gold. Folk tales of patent exploitation and corruption filter down to us. However, Dr. Glaser explains that within the scientific community at least, the roles of these processes is one of sharing rather than the hoarding of information.
Even in big pharma, where you want to derive financial benefit from the discoveries you've made, either to keep your shareholders happy or to recoup your costs in developing or put aside new development funds, even in that case, in order to patent a drug, you have to publish the formula. So having published it, then you can assert copyright or patent it and legally enforce your own right to sole manufacture or to licensing. But the patent process is effectively a process of publication and sharing, not a process of keeping secrets.
The aims of our modern science are so large and advanced that they require huge teams and myriad types of expertise across multiple fields to make real. And although we can now turn lead into gold, the principles of alchemy could never keep up with this modern scientific method. Within well-established scientific practice, checks and balances are put in place to mediate the relationships between disciplines, practices, and institutions. But what about in newer, younger fields of science, where the dreams are fresh and the potentials seemingly limitless? At the cutting edge of contemporary science, in synthetic biology, we find a nascent gold rush, both literally and figuratively.
They are out sequencing everything they can get their hands on as a way of building up this huge database of information about, genetic information about what's alive, but without necessarily a plan yet for how it's valuable. And so one person or one entity owns the information of life.
On another one of those warm September mornings deep in the heart of London's Royal College of Art, I talked to Alexandra Daisy Ginsberg about the young and flourishing scientific field of synthetic biology.
I'm Alexandra Daisy Ginsberg. I'm an artist, designer, and I'm currently doing a PhD at the Royal College of Art looking into the relationship between design and progress. I think from the outset my interest in synthetic biology was piqued by a group of engineers and scientists who were describing how they could design living things, and it was this sort of idea of design and mastery over life, and very much bringing in metaphors of control and machinery from engineering into biology.
Much of the promise of synthetic biology is tied to environmentalism and the idea that previously useless material, if catalysed in the right way through the use of engineered organisms, might potentially have new value. Alexandra Daisy Ginsberg has spent much of her career examining the hopes and dreams of synthetic biology. Her projects such as E-Chromi and synthetic aesthetics push at the potential futures of synthetic biology, prompting us to examine our contemporary values and biases.
And one of the final pieces I did for my graduation show at the RCA back in 2009 was an enormous golden intestine, which I called Colonic Alchemy. And it was very much about the sort of transmutation of shit into gold as the ultimate fascination of synthetic biology. So I think that the idea of it turning waste matter into something valuable is a theme that drives through the intentions of the field. And I think that's probably what's really relevant about synthetic biology to this discussion is the ideology rather than the science itself. The fact that it's about control, and it's about controlling matter in a way that is against nature to some extent. So a bacteria that's engineered maybe doesn't want to be engineered. It's not that it knows that it doesn't want to be, but it will evolve to get back to the state where it's most comfortable.
In her practice, Alexandra Daisy Ginsberg uses the science of synthetic biology to craft speculative visions. Projects such as Designing for the Sixth Extinction consider the use of synthetic biology as a tool for rewilding following the extinction of many of our natural species of animals. This invites us to question the notion of better, the focus of her PhD thesis at the Royal College of Art.
One of the things I'm researching is the line of progress and how design sits on that line. So we assume that we're kind of set on this path going forward and that design helps us move forward in increments, makes things better. But the line of progress is a singular vantage point. And so I'm looking at constructing kind of simultaneous realities and then how that sort of fractures, your experience of what's better compared to my experience of what's better are very different things. And which means that, as society we're all working towards a common goal, but we haven't decided what that common goal necessarily is.
Lydia Nicholas has also had a lot of involvement with the field of synthetic biology.
I am a researcher in collective intelligence at Nesta. If anyone's got a good definition of collective intelligence that will fit on a postcard, feel free to send them in on a postcard. I will put them all up around my desk. Before the whole collective intelligence thing at Nesta, I spent quite a while in a lovely design studio, science practice, working with a multidisciplinary, multi-site team of synthetic biologists. It is basically trying to reprogram living things in order to kind of change their inputs and outputs in a way that kind of helps us.
Like Alexandra Daisy Ginsberg, Lydia draws parallels between the work of synthetic biologists and alchemy.
You are talking really about writing a formula, which might be a genetic code, which has this whole element of mysticism to it. Like the wonderful thing about wet lab biology is that it kind of refuses to be completely predictable. So there'd be things about trying to turn, say, waste products into things that humans want, and fiddling around in this sort of space in between where they're desperately trying to get these living things to be this kind of catalyst. And then you put something else in and then it turns into gold.
Lydia highlights one of the major problems when working with life as a medium. It's complex and messy. The philosophy of synthetic biology, that technology and science have advanced to such a point that we can engineer it like machines, is proving difficult on the ground.
The idea of complete mastery is an illusion in synthetic biology. The idea that we could control a living system is not actually the reality. It may one day be, it's unlikely that it ever would be, but there needs to be this belief that you can to be able to do synthetic biology. So what I mean by that is biology is far more complex in the way things interact than electronics, for example, or silicon circuitry. So you have to black box things, so you have this kind of mystery starts to build into it. You have to be able to assume that this part will do this or this circuit will behave in this particular way, but at the same time you know that it's going to start interacting with other sort of genes and genes far away somewhere else.
Synthetic biology seems to bear some resemblance to what we understand of alchemy, trying to gain some mastery over the forces of nature while learning along the way about the properties and interactions of the materials and life forms that constitute the science. Even more like alchemy, as a nascent field, it has yet to fulfill its visionary promises.
I describe the way I see synthetic biology as a field, and I'm interested in the way visions are created for a field and how those visions then drive the field, is that it almost drives at two speeds. So there's the vision speed, which is will make biology reliable, and there's just a lot of work to be done. And there's the first gear, or second gear maybe they're at now, or the slower speed, which is reality, is that it's really, really difficult, and it's chipping away at foundational science to make that vision realizable. And at some point, maybe those two things will catch up and align, but actually maybe it'll go off in a different direction. So it may never be possible to achieve the things of reliably programming life to make it do exactly what we want.
For Lydia Nicholas, the pursuit of synthetic biology as a magical solution to human problems provides a distraction from dealing with these problems ourselves.
I get really interested there about the way that we try to reprogram the world in order to not have to change ourselves. That rather than changing anything to do with human culture about the way we throw things away, like that there is this idea that we will be able to find a magical solution in these hidden deep in these poor, long-suffering E. coli.
Synthetic biology provides an interesting parallel for our investigation of contemporary alchemy. A new science full of promise only just beginning to be proved, held up on the back of visions of better. It gives us the possibility to imagine and consider multiple versions of what kind of better future we might want. However, If the promises of the field aren't lived up to, it runs the risk of going the way of alchemy, falling out of favour with science and culture. Further, as Lydia Nicholas points out, we run the risk of embracing sciences like synthetic biology as magical solutions to complex human problems. Perhaps the solution to reconciling these global problems comes not from trying to create miraculous new cures and products, but as Lydia alludes to, from interrogating ourselves and our relationship with the technological systems and structures that surround us, particularly the seemingly invisible structures of data and the digital.
Data has become something of an untapped goldmine, with companies, governments and individuals trying to make sense of the vast mythos of big data as a force for change. In the sense that the pursuit of the philosopher's stone is the magnum opus, or the great work of alchemy, the crafting of the perfect algorithm is the great work of advertising companies, Netflix and Amazon recommendations. The discovery or creation of these divine algorithms turns the base materials of our attention, our disposable income and our social capital, into profit, giving the data tangible value.
My name is Wesley Goatley. I'm an artist and researcher. I work mostly with sound, specifically with data sonification in things like installation, sound sculptural objects, but also a mixture of other forms of visual media as well.
Wesley uses data as his primary medium. More than simple aestheticization, his projects interrogate the very structure of datasets, the hardware and software that supports them. A recent project, Familiars, created in collaboration with Georgina Voss, sourced data from ships, planes and trains to create a living data map and audio installation that reflected the infrastructural data space around us. The project created an eerily spatial effect of collapsed dimensions, but more than that, it was an exploration and investigation into the rights of access and politics of the data that runs the services and infrastructures we take for granted.
To try to do this grand gesture of transmutation means you have to learn a lot about the material world around you in order to get to that final point. There's no quick way to bridge that gap. So with Familiars, we had to look at exactly how all these systems, ships, planes and trains broadcast data, what the quality of that data was, how we could intercept those transmissions, if at all, what kind of geographical challenges there were in the surrounding area. But what we had to do in that whole process is figure out, what are the legal limitations that we had and the technical limitations that come as soon as we as citizens attempt to not materially affect, but just observe a system that we rely upon, extensively. So we came up against all these really interesting, technical and kind of legal boundaries that really started to reveal exactly how difficult it is as citizens to look at this, to monitor this massive system.
Wesley seems to be on a quest to gain and share understanding of the systems and infrastructures around us. Familiars very literally places visitors in the centre of a web of infrastructural systems, giving the visitor a privileged God's eye view of the world around them. But what if another approach is to give up and become helpless in the complex web of systems, algorithms and data that structure our world?
The idea of helplessness is related to the idea and question of agency. Because if you have agency, you're not helpless.
Erica Scorti takes a different tact in her work, allowing herself to become a willing test subject for the systems and processes in our everyday technological world. Recent projects such as Think You Know Me, performed live at Transmediale in 2015, see her reading predictive text suggestions live from her phone, as well as any incidental notifications she receives during that performance.
So my name's Erica Scorti, and I'm an artist and a writer, is normally how I describe myself. I think in a lot of my work, I certainly wouldn't describe it as becoming helpless, but there's an element of wanting to give up control. And this again comes from a history of looking at performance as well, and the way that this heightens a sense of immediacy is if not everything is under the artist or performer's control. And again, if you look at something like stand-up, let's say comedy, there is a kind of script, but there's something that's left open, and that space of indeterminacy is something I'm really interested in but also, again, as a process, as a way of working. But in terms of the question of working with technology, it's about looking at this relationship between, let's say, the human and the machine, or the artist and the tools that they use, and this kind of interplay between the dynamic of control and giving up control, and agency and lack of agency, and how that's also a metaphor for the wider ways in which we relate to the technologies that we use, and our feeling of kind of powerlessness towards them.
Erica's work deals with the lived experience of being human, the prosaic interactions we might have with our technologies, rather than the fantastic nature of the superstructures that support them. I was interested in something Lydia Nicholas suggested about how we might sometimes mistake data in its absolute explicitness for some kind of higher truth about ourselves.
When I was interviewing a lot of people that do quantified self-work on themselves, like they change their kind of diets and they track all of their different sort of chemical levels, and they track their GitHub commits, and they track their weight loss, and they track their activity, and there's an interesting point at which some people will say to you that they trust the numbers more than they trust themselves, and that is something that is worth dwelling on. I don't have that many answers about it, but there is definitely a kind of an interesting thing going on there of that your belief around what is real and more real, more valid, more valuable, more useful, it's the quantified stuff rather than your actual direct experience of your own body.
There's a sense of having completely inhabiting an ontology of quantification and of metrics, which is that I can be measured. I can be measured with the purpose of getting better, which I see as very much part of a kind of enlightenment project of progress, of constant productivity and efficiency. And again, it's the faith in that which drives the idea that there is this kind of that you can create this image of yourself through the data that can almost be more real than yourself. And I think that's really interesting, because it's, again, there's a putting faith in that kind of doppelganger, in that kind of data double. But what is that faith resting on? It's resting on this idea that maybe these measurements are not biased by things like human emotion or laziness or just not feeling like putting in the data today, you know.
If we are truly immersed in a datascape, what does that do to our understanding and projections of ourselves? If the elements are all there, all of that data, and the recipes of the algorithm are present, what happens when the result is not quite as you expect? To grasp our identity and self through data, when we barely understand that process ourselves, leaves a space for mistakes wide open. Our data enters and leaves in a different form, often unexpected, but we are never privy to its workings. Imperfect clones, or rather data doubles, of these failed experiments, these incorrect versions of you, build up in an effort to refine a process that we have no understanding of in the first place. This is where we need to critically grasp the nature of this data, a practice so many artists are embracing, to expose the systems at play in ways that allow us to experiment and break and ultimately make tangible this invisible world. As Wesley points out, his own work looks at an important aspect of data that is often overlooked, the presence of inherent biases, and how using it as a medium can be problematic.
I think that, for me, the most sort of interesting part of the process of making a data aestheticization, where you take data and transform it into a different aesthetic state than it was originally, which can be like sonification or probably more commonly visualization, is what I find that I always come up against really quickly in that process is composer or author bias in that. So, I mean, I think it's probably widely acknowledged, although it should probably be more widely acknowledged, that that data has a politic. It's not a naturally occurring resource that has sprung out of the ground. It's something that somebody has made using a system that somebody else made. And built on possibly someone else's platform. So each of those layers has a politic involved in that, and when it comes into the data set that we receive before we even aestheticize it into this new form, which we will probably then present to somebody else, there's all these nested politics that are already in there. But then you, as the author of this aestheticization work, then have to deal with your own biases, your composer bias and your author bias, in terms of how you aestheticize it.
If one approach to handling the material of data is to tread delicately, softly and critically, Erica espouses another: total submersion in the material and the casting off of objectivity.
There's a kind of feminist methodology to this, which argues that the very idea of objectivity is flawed. So why not completely flaw it and see what that can generate? And one way to do that is to not claim any kind of critical or objective distance from your area of study, and instead to kind of immerse yourself in it fully, where the insights being gleaned aren't particularly scientific. They can't be, let's say, reproduced, because a scientific experiment is successful if it can be reproduced and exactly the same thing happens. So instead, it's much more of a practice of just kind of testing and seeing with myself embedded, and instead of kind of trying to hide the experimenter, the person conducting the experiment, making their own position completely visible within it.
Erica's notion of throwing yourself into the technology, into the experiment, opens up the possibility of serendipity, of finding the unexpected in the data or the technology. We should cast off the notion that data is absolute and objective and accept its and our own fallibility. In doing so, we can also accept the biases and politics that Wesley Goatley points out in the way we see and read the digital landscape. In conducting his experiments, Martin Howes explains that what he really hopes for is the unexpected.
Knowing a bit about what you are kind of interested in seeing, but what you are kind of interested in seeing is, that's the kind of the paradox, is it is something which is kind of unexpected that you haven't really kind of accounted for, and hopefully you can kind of ad hoc those material conditions to provide for those surprises or accidents or unexpected ways of doing something. So making an unexpected connection is the kind of the desired outcome.
Alchemy, in good humour, could be said to be a practice of mistakes. The prescribed recipes were notoriously hard to decipher, often written in cryptic, metaphorical language, and even, if accurately deciphered, other forces were seen to have a hand in the failure of experiments.
If something went wrong, it could be because the substance you thought you were using was not the right one or didn't have the right degree of purity. Then, of course, you needed to interpret the method properly. So, again, since the recipes did not give exact time measurements, volume, etc., there was all sorts of things that could go wrong there. But even if you had deciphered the recipe properly, used good ingredients, applied the correct method, and done absolutely everything right, the recipe could still go wrong, was another explanation, because you were not deemed to be worthy of the secret.
Much like Erica Scorti, Wesley Goatley, and Martin Howes have all alluded to, it is in the very act of performing rituals, investigation, and experimentation respectively that discoveries are made. Erica's surrendering of control for her performances traces her path, using herself as a vehicle through the prosaic systems of our technological landscape. For Wesley Goatley, the rigorous investigation of the infrastructures that support our lives show where control lies, and for Martin Howes, experimentation produces serendipitous revelations of the connections between things. The larger question we now need to ask is whether there really is someone or something that keeps knowledge secret from us, as the alchemists say, and whether there really is any great secret to reveal in the first place.
What does it mean to reveal the secret? Historically, there was a worry that showing too much and reducing the mysteries of nature to something altogether more human, and therefore less divine, might be a dangerous process. As Girolamo Fracastore, a scholar of mathematics and physical sciences, once said in 1538, "It seems that what is deeply concealed in nature, and belongs to the realm of things divine and celestial, should be the object of reticence and silence, or at least communicated not only modestly, but as it were with a measure of decency. For it seems that it would not be without a measure of offence that one would repeat in public what nature herself has wished to be profoundly hidden. Of course, this refers more to the role of the scientist in general, where the scientist should go and not explore further. If we look at this in terms of what we tell the outer world, those not in the inner circle in the practice of science communication and public engagement, what should we hold back, and should we at all?
In terms of how science works in public, I think that's an interesting point of transition. So we have in the UK at least a thing these days called public engagement with science, which is the successor term to public understanding of science. And what public engagement says is that it's okay for non-experts, for the public, for artists, for designers, for people who aren't scientists in that domain, to interrogate and demand explanations of a bit of science. That whereas, and this is still to some extent true in the States, was the case in UK, scientific stories were told from on high, and you could be instructed as a member of the public on how to interpret them and listen to them. Now we're increasingly getting the public to ask the questions. And to that extent, it feels to me as if the trend in public engagement with science is to make it less magical, to make the cogs and levers of the scientific apparatus and also of how science works sociologically more apparent, and to demystify the scientist's role.
And for the science itself,
there's increasing evidence that in almost all of the areas of science we've looked at, engaging the public, which is to say not just lecturing to them, but actually having a conversation where the public is allowed to ask whatever questions they want and to interrogate and come back on things, bring their own experience and their own insights, that scientists who do that are more successful at what they do on average than those that don't.
From Alexandra Daisy Ginsberg's point of view, the aim is to highlight our embedded norms by creating dissonance and disgust.
What the work I've done in design, where we sort of try and come up against our cultural horror through disgust in this case, is one way of doing it. Yes, you kind of explore the values, you explore your own boundaries and problems and things. Really what it gets to is bringing things into visibility, making the invisible visible. And so using design as a tool not to solve any kinds of problems, but to make bumps and to make useful bumps in the world around us, to make it less, rather than just smoothing the corners and saying, well, this is how we want the world to be. It's saying, well, what is the world that we want now? Or what is the world that we'd like to have, but we're never going to get to, but if we're going the way we are.
The idea of making the invisible visible is commonly invoked in the art and design world. For science, this engagement is reciprocal, increasing the effectiveness of scientific work and helping the public to understand these processes. But what does it give us on a more human scale? How does understanding scientific processes and technologies begin to transform us?
I mean, it's about bringing attention to the things that we don't normally see. And for me, that's what successful art does for me, is things that change the way I see the world. And design used in this way is about bringing awareness, and by having awareness you have knowledge and you can choose how to act, and maybe that's the next stage, is, well, what do we do then with this knowledge? But even having the knowledge is power. So with synthetic biology, it is literally making the invisible visible. It's making products out of things that you couldn't necessarily see before from raw ingredients. But with this kind of knowledge work, I guess it's up to us. But if we know more, that's the whole pursuit of science. It's like, to know more will somehow improve us.
Wesley Goatley, talking about his latest project Familiars, extols the project of not just making the invisible visible, but of making it physical and real.
What was nice for us was to be able to use the fact that you were taking all this information down antenna to really start to disrupt that notion of data as being this very abstracted thing that was kind of somewhat distant to us and lived in this kind of cyber other world, and instead think about it as a physical substrate that sits over the world and we just kind of tune in and out of, which again is very similar to the ways that occult mystics, all for the last 500-600 years or so, have been thinking about there being like latent energies, like mesmeric fluid, and these kind of, that people have always looked for ways to get more out of the world around them, kind of tune into to what must be these kind of very interesting hidden systems that are moving around us all the time, and certainly like that was Mesmer's interest, although clearly Mesmer was also a con man. But I do think that pointing people to a thing and saying, yeah, but actually look at it, kind of like what happens when you really look hard at a thing that's meant to be invisible. I mean, I think just trying to reveal something that's meant to be hidden, that's kind of that it's not meant to be something you think about all the time. These are infrastructures that we are only really meant to notice when they malfunction or fail. When your Amazon package doesn't turn up the day that you were told it would, or that there was not asparagus in Sainsbury's when you wanted asparagus that day, or when your wireless network suddenly it doesn't work, or the website you were going to before is suddenly on a blacklist because of the home parental controls or something that are set on your ISP. So these are systems that you only really think about when they break down, and because they don't do that often, or not in ways necessarily we always see, being able to take macro views of systems and place them physically in spaces, I think that's always really interesting.
But even if we know how the trick was done, even if this making visible gives us some insight into the processes or the data or the infrastructure that is the subject of the work, is it, to paraphrase the late Terry Pratchett, still magic?
The question of whether knowing how it works stops it from being magic or not is an interesting one. I mean, we know that if you're an expert magician and you watch a magic show, you get much less out of it, or you get very different things out of it than if you're not a magician. Now, that's partly because once you're an expert magician, as you would be as an expert dancer when you watch dance, you no longer gain aesthetic pleasure from it. It's a technical critique that you have. But I do think that even if you know that I make the ball disappear by distracting you to look at my left hand while the right hand slips it into my pocket, even if you know that that's what I'm doing, it's still magic if you can't watch me.
In order to understand the processes at work behind technologies and infrastructures, we're often told that we must learn the secret workings of them. Though it may be true that technical knowledge of their workings is privileged, I'm unconvinced that it's enough to simply see a system, and that seeing it, understanding it, and being able to do something are the same thing. It would be easy to allegorically suggest that we'd need to grasp the secrets of the alchemies at work, but to collapse the metaphor, Dr. Timmerman tells us that alchemy was never really secret to begin with.
The secrecy of alchemy is often invoked in the common perception of alchemy, but there wasn't that much secrecy about it, really. There was natural secrecy in it, in that the recipes were written in a very metaphorical manner. So just to give you an example, it does not say put sulfur and mercury together and heat them for 3 hours until they melt, at which point a fume will come out and a third substance will separate from it, which you need to mix back into it. It would say, take the king and the queen and put them together in a bed, and they will bear a child which the king must eat, right? And for king and queen, it could really be any substance, any pair of substances that had opposing principles. So the male and the female as a way of separating or distinguishing between the two. So part of the so-called secrecy of alchemy lies in it being cryptic to anyone who approaches it without the background knowledge, or even to those with knowledge, because that's part of the interpretation and the skill.
If the secret of alchemy is in interpreting the metaphors that lie at the heart of its instruction, then perhaps the secrets of understanding our technological landscape are more mundane and prosaic than some great work of making visible.
This question of revealing and unpicking is something that I find a little bit tricky, because it seems to suggest that there is a reality out there, there is an infrastructure, there is a form of knowledge, that if only I can find the right tools and unpick it in the right way, then I can expose it, and then we can see the light. And this was one of the main ways that I was going to link to the idea of alchemy, because from what I've understood of it, there's this sense that, yes, it's about the turning of base metals into gold, but it's also about the sense of reaching some form of enlightenment. and some kind of exposure there. And I think there's an interesting parallel there between a lot of these practices. A lot of people use the expression of making visible, and I thought that was kind of interesting. It's this quest for an enlightenment, that there is this goal, and and the goal is the making of the gold. Okay, that might be the final point, but again, so to me, this idea of revealing and of making visible falls back on this idea that there is some kind of predetermined aspect of knowledge that just needs to be cracked, which I think that suggests that kind of knowledge is imminent, it's there, we just need to find it, whereas I would rather say that by doing these things, knowledge is always created by every undertaking, by every unpicking, by every process that we engage with, and it's not a predetermined one.
This idea of there being something hidden within technology, like some kind of hidden intention, which becomes some kind of conspiracy notion, or which I think is kind of quite interesting, but to some degrees it kind of obscures the more obvious questions of technology. Like I would never say I was revealing these sites of execution because they're they're so kind of blatant and obvious where they are, but it's more that there is never that focus on that obviousness.
This point of view would seem to align closer with the practice of alchemy. Although the ultimate goal was the discovery of the Philosopher's Stone, the wider quest was the discovery and understanding of God's creation, experiments in the interaction of the materials of the world. Far from the megalomaniacal alchemist of pop culture, desperate for wealth and glory, the truth is of a much more humble story.
Alchemists were not playing God. They were actually being good Christians by trying to understand how the world works.
Whether we choose to use the idea of revealing some truth, or simply to share the lived experience of being human in a technological system, all these practices seek to build connection and meaning to things that might otherwise seem intractable, disconnected or distant. In that, they are so like alchemy, in trying to structure and understand the relative relationships and matter of the stuff that makes up the world. Toward the end of my conversation with Dr. Timmerman, I asked her what a contemporary alchemy might be.
I can't really come up with anything. Because it would have to be something that many people with different interests but a common understanding of how the world works would be interested in, and would be interested in enough to do it in their own time, but have the promise of getting something valuable out of it. As for the spirit, that sounds incredibly wrong, but the spirit of alchemy, the reason why people set off to do alchemy for such extended periods of time and kept on engaging with it, and the hopes they had for it, and the practical use they got out of it, that I think we can see in science all around.
So many of the conversations we've had during Haunted Machines have come back to knowledge and power. The ideas of revelation, understanding, and enlightenment we seek through critical art and design work, as well as scientific practice, is ideologically no different from the alchemical pursuits of old. That we might seek in some way to be closer to the divine, whether that's God or Google.
If alchemy teaches us anything, it's all about process. Where magic focuses its energies on intent and result, where the process is largely symbolic and incidental, alchemy obsesses over process, over detail and accuracy, over the lived experience of learning.
Whether the tools we have for interrogating and critiquing technologies, systems and sciences are having an effect on the way they are developed, or the way we live with them remains to be seen.
We've heard about the history of alchemy, and how the professionalization and specialization changed the landscape of natural philosophy, converting it into the new field of science where alchemy was not welcome. The construction of rules and institutions to provide checks and balances and ensure rigor meant alchemy could never fit in this world. With synthetic biology, we see a field struggling to gain mastery over new and complex types of tools and processes, concerned that it may not be able to live up to the promise of better it espouses, but offering us the opportunity to challenge our conceptions about what we think better actually is. In working critically with data and the digital, we see the importance of the role of process. whether in attempting to reveal the invisible infrastructures that support our technological lives, or in giving up control to demonstrate the fallibility of ourselves and technology. Finally, we're faced with the question of revealing, and what this act of interrogating and then presenting the normally hidden do, and whether there was really anything hidden in the first place. Through all these, we find parallels with alchemy, practitioners gathering and communicating complex understandings at points of collapse between hardware, software, earth and humans. I'm tended to agree with Dr. Timmerman. There is no modern alchemy, not in the sense that alchemy ever was. Our world is too complex, bound up in systems and structures, for it to be true that a linear, unquestioning pursuit of some truth could reveal enlightenment. At one point in our interview, I suggested to Dr. Timmerman that cold fusion bore resemblance to alchemy, something of once great promise, discredited by the wider community, and finding refuge in the fringes of physics as a quasi-occult side project, and she offered her own parallel.
It's an analogy that almost works, but it reminds me of your cold fusion experiment is really looking for a cure for cancer. We haven't done it yet. Everything tells us that we ought to get more of a grip on it. It gets more and more complicated as you go along because we learn more about the disease or the diseases that make up cancer, and it's just too good an idea to give up.
Perhaps in the pursuit of ideas too good to give up, or abandon regardless of how far-fetched they may seem, we see a change in ourselves that we didn't expect, a transformation that tells us more about who we are now rather than who we hope to become.
From Haunted Machines, comprising myself, Tobias Revel, and Natalie Kane, our thanks go out to all those involved in the recording and production of this radio broadcast. Lydia Nicholas, Wesley Goatley, Dr. Daniel Glazer, Alexandra Daisy Ginsberg, Erica Scorti, Dr. Anka Timmerman, and Martin House. Special thanks also go to Wesley Goatley for his help with mastering, editing, and providing the soundtrack that has accompanied this broadcast. There is no light but what lives in the sun. There is no sun but which is twice begot. Nature and art the parents first begon. By nature 'twas, but nature perfects not. Art then what nature left in hand doth take, and out of a one a twofold work doth make.